Welcome to the Well Seasoned Librarian Podcast. This is Season 6, Episode 8. My name is Dean Jones. I'm the host on the program. I've been very honored to be able to talk to some of our scholarly guests we have had on the show, and so many of them have been so gracious to me and really wonderful people to talk to. Kevin Wetmore is not the least of them. Able to beat me in a brain wrestling match with one cerebellum tied behind its lobe tied behind its back, so to speak. He was such a down-to-earth and gracious guest, and so very affable. I really enjoyed talking to him, and I would gratefully have him on the show again. Wetmore has a pedigree that is beyond impressive, with a BA in Classical Dramatic Studies from Bates College, an MA in Theater Arts, Focus Directing, University of Leeds, Certificate in Japanese Studies from the University of Pittsburgh, an MA in Theological Studies from LMU, a Ph.D. in Theater and Performance Studies, University of Pittsburgh, an honorary degree in Metaphysics from Miskatonic University. Wink. A study once described Kevin's teaching style as though one is playing a game of Trivial Pursuit with Jack Black. Eaters of the Dead, Myths and Realities of Cannibal Monsters came out last year from Recreon Books. It's a whirlwind tour through the mythology of cannibalism and the impact of this myth in the psyche of our culture in film and art. I wholly recommend this work to you. It's really worth reading. Without further ado, we go to our conversation with Kevin J. Wetmore. Welcome to the Well Seasoned Librarian Podcast. I'm Dean Jones, your host. Today, I'm very happy to be having on our program actor, author, comedian, scholar, Kevin J. Wetmore, Ph.D., authors of Eaters of the Dead, Myths and Realities of Cannibal Monsters. Kevin, welcome to the show.
It's an honor and a pleasure to be here, sir. Thank you for the invitation.
Now, for our listeners who are not familiar with you, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I'm a professor of theater arts at Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles. As you mentioned, I'm also an actor and director and writer and stage combat choreographer. I like to teach actors how to hurt each other safely. I like to joke on campus that I'm not only the only professor who gets to hit his students, I also get to grade them on how well they take it. So it's a good job most days. And then in my other life, I've always been fascinated by horror, so even though I'm a Shakespearean scholar and a Shakespearean actor, I run the Shakespeare Festival at LMU. I'm also a horror writer. I'm very active in the Horror Writers Association, and I do all sorts of fun things in terms of writing about monster culture and ghosts on the Japanese stage, for example. And one of the coolest things I get to do is every year in October, I turn my university's library into a literary haunted house. Instead of people jumping out and yelling boo, they jump out and do a scene from Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, or
nice.
The Shadows of the Witch House. So each year it's thematically linked to whatever the special collection exhibit is. We're in our 10th year right now, and it's really exciting. Students walk through it. So it's a sort of theatrical performance of scenes from horror novels and short stories, but all set within a library. And we do a lot of scenes in places where you're not allowed to go. So it's really fun, and kind of uncanny for our audiences that this is the library, but suddenly the stacks are draped in black velvet, and there's this very bizarre looking woman with a blindfold on sitting there with tarot cards spread out in front of her, and she's telling us to come closer. So
Nice.
It's fun, yeah. And the library, I love partnering with our library. They're great hosts and supporters, and the librarians themselves are a lot of fun. A lot of times I'll write roles for individual librarians to perform in the show.
Nice.
So it's a lot of fun, and so I'm delighted to be on a podcast with the Well Seasoned Librarian.
Thank you.
Since librarians are my people.
Yeah. We have a lot of interests, and we always love working with people and authors and stuff. So it's always great to collaborate and work with people, because I think it's one of the reasons why we go into the job is we get to talk to authors and have events for authors and stuff. It's always really fun. Now, I was going to ask you, I'm a big horror fan myself. And I was going to ask you, who are some of your inspirations for your writing?
Oh, good Lord. I really like, H.P. Lovecraft is problematic because of his endemic racism, but you have to give the guy credit for the way in which he sort of transformed the way we understand horror. Yeah. And then, so I suppose Lovecraft's children, Ramsey Campbell, Victor Thompson, even up to and including Neil Gaiman, people who are sort of playing in that cosmic world, I find fascinating. I have my favorite authors, people like Jonathan Mayberry, Josh Mallerman, Lisa Morton, Anya Alborn. Oh God, there's so many. Joe R. Lansdale, I think, is really interesting from Hartford, Texas. He does a lot of good stuff, and he's written some of the most disturbing fiction I've ever read, which is none of it is supernatural. Well, he has supernatural stuff, but none of his supernatural stuff I find as terrifying as his real life stuff, just dealing with sort of the ugly racism and class conflicts in the South. There are a lot of younger writers that I'm really excited about who are coming along with a lot of stuff. I'm just sort of looking down the road here at all the different books. I'm sort of all over the map. There are African authors that I really like. There are Japanese authors that I positively adore. There are some really interesting older authors. M.R. James, I've been reading a lot lately. In terms of adapting for the stage to perform in the library, I suppose I do a lot of James. I do a lot of Lovecraft. I do a lot of Poe. Um, and they all present their own challenges for adaptation. So, in terms of my own writing, there are some scholars out there. Carol Clover obviously has really shaped how I think. I think Jeffrey Andrew Weinstock, Murray Leader, and Simon Bacon are all doing really interesting work, both as scholars in their own right and as editors, sort of gathering together people to talk about how horror works and why things frighten us. And so it's nice to be with the other weird kids who grew up loving monsters, and we the internet has helped us find our tribe and go, oh, let's talk about this because it's all fun and fascinating.
Well, I have been recently rereading Yukio Mishima's The Sailor Who Fell to Grace from the Sea. And I mean, I don't know, I guess you would call it horror in a way. It's a horrific story.
Yeah.
Are you familiar with his work at all?
Oh, good Lord, yes. Mishima ga suki desu yo. I'm a fan of Mishima. He's another interesting character. I mean, his life is sort of this fascinating story. But I was just reading an article by Henry Hughes that was arguing that we should consider Mishima as a kind of Gothic author, because he's really about the crushing weight of the past and the natural environment sort of challenging Japanese male identity. And he himself, of course, was homosexual and a hardcore conservative. And he would sort of get into these knockdown, drag out arguments with the leftists who sort of shared his rejection of things Western, but disagreed about how to create Japanese identity. And as a result, you have these fascinating plays as modern no plays like the Rokumekan and Madame de Sade, which is his piece about the wife of the Marquis de Sade. Sailor Who Fell from Grace with the Sea, obviously a really powerful novel, and oddly made into a film, I think, with Chris Christopherson in the United States back in the 70s, which just kind of blows my mind.
Yeah, I remember seeing that when I was young and just being really drawn to how weird and surreal it was, because this predated like Cronenberg and David Lynch, all these people, but yet it was such an odd, I mean, it was a huge, I think I like to refer to that film as one of those films that is the cinematic turd in the punch bowl that kind of like throws people and like they leave the theater going, what the hell? I mean, today it would be a different take, but like in the 70s, It's like, what the hell did I just watch?
Oh, when it came out in America, no one knew what to do with it.
Yeah.
And for the Japanese, they're like, oh yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
In terms of grotesque and surreal, the Japanese author Edogawa Rampo, Japanese author who was a huge fan of Edgar Allan Poe, so he changed his name to Edogawa Rampo.
I like that.
And sort of a homonym there. And he has written actually one of the most disturbing short stories I've ever read about a young man who falls in love with a young woman. And he notes that every night she sits in this overstuffed armchair. So one day when she's out, he breaks into her house, cuts open the back of the chair, removes all the stuffing, and climbs in it himself. And so every night she sort of sits in the chair, unaware that she's actually sitting in his lap.
Oh my God.
And he leaves the chair once a day when she's out to go to the bathroom and eat. But he just lives inside her chair and she's completely unaware of it. And just the way Edogawa writes it's from his point of view, and it's profoundly disturbing. And the nice thing about Edogawa is in about the past 20 or so years, I think more and more English speakers are learning about him. So more and more of his work has been translated. And if you like that sort of thing, I highly recommend Edogawa Rampo. And there's some great translations out there of his work. But now, your skin will crawl.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's so many. I think today there's an embarrassment of horror that I can't. In my lifetime, I don't know if I'll ever get to read it all. It's just like so much great stuff right now.
Yeah, we're living in a golden era of publication and literature, and you're right. I have about 700 books. I'm not kidding, piled up in the bookcases next to my bed, which I refer to as the Great Unread. My TBR pile. Going, I don't know if I'm going to finish this because it never seems to go down, even as I read a half dozen books a week, somehow 8 more find their way into the pile. So
Yeah.
it's breeding like tribbles, and I'm okay with that.
Yeah. I have a wish list on Amazon that just keeps growing. My wife's like, where do I
Mhm.
begin here? I'm like, I have no idea. Like, sorry. It's just
My friend Anthony says, and I appreciate this, one's library should be aspirational.
yeah, yeah,
That it's not what I've done, but what I plan to do.
yeah. I like that. That makes a lot of sense to me.
Mhm.
Let's talk about your book. I mean, I'm
Sure.
really jazzed about this book, Eaters of the Dead: Myths and Realities of Cannibal Monsters. We've seen more and more TV shows, movies, and writing that talk about cannibalism. Where do you think the uptick on talking about cannibalism came in our culture?
Uh, well, I mean, there are a couple different things there, and before we go on, I do want to sort of twist one thing. It's called Myths and Realities of Cannibal Monsters, but the book is not just about cannibals because it's about anthropophagy. So it's not just, cannibal is like eats like. So people eating
Right.
people are cannibals, birds eating birds are cannibals, and this is about things that eat human corpses,
Gotcha.
which of
Okay.
course includes human cannibals. So we're also looking at things like ghouls, aswang, wendigo, jinkiniki, all sorts of Australian cannibal monster, well, not cannibal monster, anthropophagus monsters, monsters that eat dead humans. But that also includes the bacteria within our own body. The second you die, you're starting to be eaten. In terms of our culture and cannibal, to actually answer the question you asked, I think it has to do with consumption. I think it has to do with this whole idea of eat or be eaten, and that more and more our society is aware of ourselves as consumers and aware of ourselves as being consumed. And I see bumper stickers like, if you don't know what's for dinner, then you're on the menu, or if you're not cooking. This whole notion of, as I said, eat or be eaten, that we live in a consumer society in which the ultimate commodity is the human body. And we talk about, just my job is devouring me. It's devouring all my time, and we tend to think of things in terms of eating, and historically have for the longest time. The word sarcophagus literally means eater of flesh, that the box that you're put into when you die eats your flesh. And when you look at medieval theater, because I'm a theater guy, the way that they show the end of the world is you have a giant hell mouth on stage. It is literally a giant mouth, a giant head with flames in the mouth that people get thrown into at the end of the world. And so it's this notion of no matter what happens to us, we will eventually be devoured. And we also have concerns. I mean, we talk about supply chains right now. We're sort of obsessed with this notion of the cost of things going up. And as I was at the supermarket earlier today, and I saw that the price of some goods that I buy regularly has gone up by another 10 cents. And okay, 10 cents is 10 cents, whatever. But over the cost of time, I went, oh, 2 years ago, this was like $2 less. So
Right.
we're aware both of consumption, but also how much it costs to put things into the munching cave. Uh, I think it's also this thing that's sort of atavistic within us. When you look at kids and dogs, they test the world through the mouth. My kids are older now, but when they were toddlers, it's a constant. The number one refrain is, don't put that in your mouth. Don't put that in your mouth, because everything goes in the mouth. And we tend to think of things in terms of, uh, as my dog says, can I eat this? This is a thing that I'm just going to eat. So I think partly it has to do with consumption and our fears of both consumption and being consumed. I think as a culture, we are much more aware of what goes into our body now. All these conversations about food, cholesterol, and sort of the changing scientific consensus. Alcohol is terrible for you, but you should drink a glass of red wine a day. Don't eat any eggs. Eat as many eggs as humanly possible. Eat one egg, but feel bad about it. That we're
Yeah.
looking at all the different ways in which the stuff that goes into us both make us up, but are good for us or bad for us. So I think there's an element of that going on as well. And then lastly, it is this fear, an atavistic fear, if I may be so bold, of being prey. We fancy ourselves to be, sophisticated, intelligent creatures that invented the internet and power clashing. But the simple and sad fact of the matter is, we're only a few thousand years out from. We go up in the trees, so the things downstairs don't get us, and unfortunately, there are snakes in the trees.
Yeah.
So we remember on one level what it's like. And while I was researching the book, I read some accounts of people who had been inside animals, so to speak. A woman who had been bitten on the head by a crocodile and dragged under the water, people who have been attacked by sharks, and just talk about that moment of realizing suddenly that you are prey. that despite being a human being, you are actually meat for someone or something else. And so I think on a fundamental level, we fear that. I teach a course in horror at the university, and one of the first questions I ask is, how many of you have ever dove into a swimming pool, and then when you surfaced, immediately looked around to make sure there wasn't a shark in the pool? And over 3/4 of the class will raise their hand.
Yeah.
And we all have a laugh. I'm like, exactly. Intellectually, you know that there cannot be, like, even if it's the best practical joke in the world, no one's going to throw a great white in the swimming pool after you just jumped in.
Yeah.
But we look around to make sure there isn't one, because on some level, we are afraid of we don't look around to see if there's a sea snake in the pool. And I'm like, oh, is there a snake in here? I mean, being bitten by a venomous snake is scary. Being eaten by a shark, I think it's much, much scarier. Far more people are bitten by snakes than eaten by sharks. But eaten by sharks is a much greater fear for most people. We don't want to be eaten, and we're afraid of it. And we're also concerned with what happens to our body after we die. And that's another reason why we're sort of having these conversations, is quite simply that we've been talking a lot about what happens when you die. That burial, cremation, and there's a new method of cremation that uses alkaline water, I guess. So
Yes.
it requires far less toxic waste. But also the idea of a green burial, that your remains are put in a burlap sack with some seeds. Obviously grossly oversimplifying, but what do we do with this thing when it's gone? And our own, for lack of a better term, the tension between acknowledging people as people and recognizing the body is somehow not me. When someone dies, we have all this language. They're in a better place. So, well, they're at peace now. And I remember at my grandmother's funeral, someone telling me, your grandmother's in a better place. I'm like, no, she's in that box over there. The box is not a better place. But we like to think of this, the sarx, the human flesh, as not really us. It's the thing we carry around, but it's not us. And yet we're terrified of what's going to happen to it after we're dead. That's one of the things that sort of the news gushes about. A hiker was found in the woods. They had clearly passed away from dehydration, and animals had been at the body. And that's somehow the worst part.
Yeah.
The local news has to get salacious and tell us all the bad things that also happened to the corpse. And on the one hand, I'm like, the person was dead. They didn't feel anything. They didn't suffer. This is just, unto dust we are returning, since we're in Lent. But there's this pushback of, no, I don't want bad things to happen to my body.
Yeah.
And we have laws against abuse of corpses, and this idea of things being done to dead bodies is somehow horrible and wrong. And I'm not saying they're not, but it's rooted in this idea that, in this tension of, my body is both me and not me, but don't you dare do anything to it after I'm gone, other than put it in a box.
Now, the cover of your book has one of my favorite pieces of art, the Saturn eating his young by Goya.
Yes.
And it reminds me, I've talked to you talk to toddlers over the years. If you have kids or somebody else has kids, they'll tell you their dreams and stuff. And I think the number one thing I'm always hearing for kids is that I had a dream that my daddy ate me. That's this thing that you hear. And it's no slight against the father, I think, but they're small and we're big. And I've heard so many times, these kids saying, I was so afraid. I had this dream that my dad ate me. And it's it's in our subconscious, it's there.
Well, that painting, and I love that you brought it up, and I love that it's on the book, I think is also paradoxical in that, yes, the child fears being eaten by the parent. And, you bring this up, and somewhere out there, Freud is applauding madly. Yes, exactly. And yet at the same time, if you look at the painting, and one of the reasons why I love it is, look at Saturn's face. He is horrified at what he's doing. This is not a guy who's happy being like, well, that's nipped in the bud. This kid ain't going to hurt me. This is a creature that is beyond traumatized by what he's doing. And I think, speaking as a parent, the children are like, oh, I'm afraid, dad's going to eat me. I'm like, I'm afraid I'm going to accidentally hurt my kids. I'm a big clumsy ox. I'm walking around. These little things are running around. We're not paying attention. I'm just terrified that as a parent, you're like, I want to do the right thing. So there's this fear of bringing harm to the child and the child's fear of being hurt. And I love that this painting sort of captures both of those fears. The parent that is eating the child out of necessity to preserve his own power and integrity, but in doing so, he's becoming less than what he is and becoming this terrified monster who is as traumatized. When you read Beowulf, Grendel's not a happy camper. Grendel's not walking around, the mead hall going, this is great. I get a savory snack. I get some exercise. I get to meet some people and eat them. I'm going to go home and tell mom about this place. Grendel is not a happy person.
No.
in the Old English, they're talking about he's miserable. He's out in the fen and he's crying. He hates the meat hole because people are having fun. Grendel's kind of the original incel. He shows up because he's not happy that other people are having fun and he doesn't get to. But I talk about Grendel in the book. He's another devourer of human flesh. But when you go back and actually read the saga of Beowulf, it's this sort of pagan story with this very Christian overlay of Grendel is a descendant of Cain, and he's doing what he's doing because at heart he is evil and monstrous. And the cool thing about Beowulf is not only is he a Christian, he works out, and so he can tear off Grendel's arm and solve the problem. And then he'll go and take care of the mother and solve that problem, but he gets a little too big for his britches when he has to fight the dragon. And he'll defeat the dragon, but in the end, that's what does him in too.
Now, you touched on a lot of different stories in your work.
Yes.
One of the most famous things that I really love that you touch on is the ghouls. I've always loved the stories of ghouls. It's always intrigued me when I was a kid. I remember there was a Hammer film called The Ghoul.
Yes.
That had that topic. And I just remember seeing that when I was young going, oh, what is this? This is cool. And I remember like Lovecraft, of course, had the ghouls and the Pickman model and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
So do you want to talk about ghouls for a little bit? Because it's
Sure.
a top favorite of mine.
Top favorite of mine too. Welcome, brother. This is
the Brotherhood of the Ghoul.
Indeed. Well, I feel the ghoul is sort of so disrespected as a monster. We got vampires and werewolves and ghosts and witches, and they're all cool. And the ghoul's over there in the corner, and they're like, we invite them to the parties, but we don't let them play. Which is a shame because the ghoul is sort of the one that gets left out in terms of fear of the dead, fear of transformation, fear of women with power. And the ghoul is the fear of becoming a monster that consumes the dead and the fear of being consumed. That, ghouls make no distinction. We're all just meat to them.
Right.
So in my own fiction, I've written several ghoul stories because I love the ghoul and I want to see the ghoul get more respect. And the movie that I loved as a kid is this really goofy anthology film called The Monster Club, based on short stories by R. Chetwynd Haynes, with Vincent Price and John Carradine.
Yeah. I love that one.
Goofy movie. The soundtrack is fun and ridiculous, and it has 3 different stories, and they're all kind of silly. But the middle one is about this young man who goes to a village, or he's a filmmaker who goes to a village, and it turns out to be a village of ghouls, but he doesn't quite figure it out yet. And he meets this young woman who's sort of a half ghoul, and they shelter in the church because the ghouls can't enter there. And finally, he thinks he's made his escape. He gets through the fog that protects the village and gets out to the main road, where he's picked up by 2 policemen who are like, "Oh, don't worry about it. We'll go investigate this." And they drive back up to the village, and then they turn around and reveal that they have sharp teeth. And it turns out he's been picked up by ghoul police, and now the whole village is going to eat him. And I just remember in the middle of this very goofy movie, finding that moment where the 2 policemen turn around and smile, just being very frightened as an 11-year-old going, wait, that can happen? Now I don't trust the police, but I want to know more about these ghoul things. Yeah, they come out of Arabia. They're sort of a pre-Muslim monster that then gets taken in by Islam, and they're cursed by Allah. Dog-like creatures that consume the bodies of the dead. And then during the Enlightenment with Vathek and Voltaire and all these people sort of begin taking literature from all over the world and appropriating it. The ghoul moves west, and then, as you mentioned, Lovecraft comes in. He's like, "Oh yeah, let's do Pickman's model." And in The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath, his hero Randolph Carter goes to the city of the ghouls, and it turns out those ghouls are actually pretty cool. And then you have people like Caitlin Kiernan, who has written a whole number of ghoul-based novels, sort of the children of Lovecraft. So I just find the ghoul this sort of fascinating monster because they're humanoid, they're human, separate species, and they eat carrion, and they seem to have their own society. And even when you go back and look at the literature, and I had a great deal of fun researching this, there's this question of, okay, where do they come from? What are they? How do we fight them? And one of the places that becomes associated frequently with ghouls is, of course, Iraq and Baghdad. There are allegedly ghouls around and ghouls around Baghdad, and there are very famous ghouls in the deserts of Iraq. So I find it fascinating that this sort of monster's there, and no one as of yet has sort of exploited that in terms of telling stories about America's own misadventures in Iraq, and our sort of, here's this monster that's right there that is about desert living, that sort of becomes a perfect metaphor for exploring, just like the zombie for the past, good Lord, 20 years has been the monster metaphor du jour, or de decade. very effective in sort of conveying all kinds of different narratives. I think the ghoul is another one of those monsters whose time can come because they are malleable in terms of what they stand for. It's a monster that just eats. And as I mentioned earlier, since our society is currently obsessed with consumption, I think there's a lot that can be done with the ghoul. And in fact, there is. When you look at things like the Santa Clarita diet, that's about the consumption of human flesh. In fact, the word that we use, ghoulish, doesn't mean someone who eats dead bodies. It actually refers to someone who's really into the macabre. That, you know, if you slow down to look at the accident, if you're going online to see videos of executions or public shootings, people are like, oh, you're so ghoulish. And it's like, well, technically you're not, unless you're actually then finding those bodies and eating them. But I understand the point that the ghoul has come to be sort of, in our culture at least, understood as the monster that embodies obsession with death.
Yeah.
And that's just because the ghoul doesn't kill you. The ghoul waits for you to die and then eats you. Although in Lovecraft's case, ghouls can also kill you.
Yeah. This episode of the Well Seasoned Librarian Podcast is sponsored by the Culinary Historians of Northern California, a Bay Area educational group dedicated to the study of food, drink, and culture in human history. To learn more about this organization and their work, please visit the website at www.chnorcal.org. I wanted to also talk, you mentioned zombies, and
Yes.
that's one that's always mystified me because as a lover of horror, I remember that before the 60s, zombies never ate you.
Mhm.
They would like menace you or do the bidding of somebody else or at worst strangle you, but they weren't really eating creatures.
Right.
But after Romero's movie, all bets were off, and it suddenly became this human flesh eating creature. Do you want to talk about zombies a bit?
Sure. I would love to talk about zombies. I've actually written a book and several articles about them. And the book that I wrote, Back from the Dead, Reading Remakes of Romero's Zombie Films as Markers of Their Times, deals with this whole issue that you just brought up. That the zombie I find fascinating as well because it's the first New World monster. That
Right.
werewolves and ghouls and vampires all come from Europe and the Levant and the Middle East. But the zombie is Haitian. The zombie comes out of Haitian culture and Voodoo, which is the syncretic religion when African Orisha worship meets French Catholicism, and suddenly you get a whole bunch of bad culture. I don't mean voodoo culture is bad. I mean you get things like Live and Let Die and Angel Heart and sort of all these misunderstandings of voodoo. So let me be clear on that. Voodoo itself is wonderful. The representations of it in pop culture are not. The whole idea of the zombie, though, is it's not just a New World monster. It is a monster that is rooted in colonialism and in slavery. The idea is that even after you die, you are still enslaved. When you look at things like spirituals, the whole idea is I'm enslaved now and it's horrible, but when I die, I'll go and be with Jesus. I'll be in paradise, that I'll be
Right.
called home. And the idea of the zombie is no, you won't. That even after death, you're going to be enslaved, that you will be forced to continue to work and labor and be beaten until your bones rot from your flesh and you're no longer able to walk. That's the horror of the zombie. And what's interesting to me is then when Hollywood gets a hold of this, because William Seabrook in 29 publishes his book, The Magic Island, which he talks about Haiti and says, oh, and there, I saw these workers called zombie, and they were out in the fields and they were laboring and they didn't talk and they didn't do anything other than the labor they were told to. And then someone fed them salt and they tried to claw their way back in the graves. And Hollywood, never one to miss on a bad idea, except the ghoul, goes, oh, we can use that. And so you get film like White Zombie, and the name itself shows sort of the what a racist monster this is. It's bad when it happens to black people, but the real horror is if it happens to a blonde white woman.
Oh, yeah,
She
yeah.
becomes a white zombie. And it's the same exact plot with I Walk with a Zombie. And the difference is, so the whole idea of a zombie is you have a zombie master. You have a Bokor. You have someone in White Zombie. It's Bela Lugosi playing Murder Lagrange, which is just a wonderful name, and it's Lugosi. So you have the person who reanimates the zombies and is responsible for them. And Romero comes along and says, here are reanimated dead people. There's no zombie master. There's some scientific explanation. Maybe it's a virus. Maybe it's the Venus probe. Maybe it's something that has reanimated the dead. And so and in Night of the Living Dead, they never use, as Simon Pegg puts it, the Z word. Zombie is never used in that film. They call them ghouls, interestingly enough, because they eat the dead. And they call them things, those things out there. The zombie word isn't used, but people are like, oh, they're reanimated dead people, so they're zombies. Because we have, in addition to White Zombie and I Walk with a Zombie, you've got all these B movies from the 50s and 60s, like Zombies of the Stratosphere, starring a young Leonard Nimoy. You've got The Incredibly Strange Creatures Who Stopped Living and Became Mixed Up Zombies, Cash Flag's 1964 whack job thing.
Oh boy,
Uh,
that was a hell of a film.
yeah. So the word zombie is out there in terms of mindless dead things, but it was Romero's film that other people then said, oh, those are zombies, and that's what zombies are. And Romero zombies then became the zombie.
Right.
So the Italians become involved, and you get Folky and, Zombie 3, House by the Cemetery, City of the Living Dead. And then, of course, Romero's sequel in 78, 10 years later, Dawn of the Dead. And by Day of the Dead in 85, the Romero zombie is firmly cemented as this is what zombies are. In fact, more people know about that, I think, than they do the Haitian zombie. And for my money, it's actually after 9/11 that we really hit the zombie renaissance, because that's when you start getting fast zombies. Slow zombie, if you look at Romero's movies, even they say, look, they're slow. One at a time, they're fine. You hit them with a rock, hit them in the head, bury them, burn them, whatever, they're fine. The problem with zombies is, en masse, they're a danger. Once there are 3 or 4 surrounding you, you're going to go down. And so what makes that even more scary after 9/11, as horror begins to shift and change in response to the 9/11 experience, zombies get fast. Whereas Romero zombies are slow and moaning. The fast zombies scream. Their facial expression is one of rage. With 28 Days Later, even though technically they're not zombies, they're infected human beings. They're called rage zombies. And it's this notion of zombies aren't just out to slowly surround the house and eat you and dance with Michael Jackson. By 2002, zombies are fast. They hate you and they want to convert you to their way of life.
Yeah. And
So
yeah, it's such a terrifying thing, because even if you've seen many, many zombie films, you can't help but have your skin crawl by the idea of these creatures biting you, ripping you apart with their teeth. It's just horrifying.
indeed, and that ties back into the subject of my book in terms of contagion, in terms of the mouth being a scary thing because we don't want to be eaten. And what's interesting about zombies is they don't eat you fully. They just bite you and take bites out of you and eat you until you die. And then suddenly they lose all interest and you rise up and become one of them. And that's a main point of the book, is that the 2 great fears associated with all of these monsters are of being eaten and of eating. And when you go back and look at plays like Thyestes by Seneca or Shakespeare's Titus Andronicus, most famously, the great horror is, of course, that you are tricked into eating human flesh. And even worse, what is called incestuous cannibalism, that you are tricked into eating your relatives. That the one line of Shakespeare that not even Sir Patrick Stewart could pull off, "Where are my sons? There they are, baked in that pie." You just can't pull that line off. But audiences always laugh. But that's the horror of it, is you just ate your own kids. I killed your kids and made them into food and you ate it.
Yeah.
And that's the horror of it. So the horror is eating, and the horror is being eaten by cannibal monsters, but also the horror of eating. When you look at the survivors, for example, of the Donner Party, they're sort of forever marked as the ones who ate their families.
Yeah.
And a number of them sort of try very hard to disappear into anonymity or not be known for that. But it's this notion of people who have eaten flesh of the dead, and especially people who have eaten flesh of their own family members. In fact, the Donner Party, when they were starving, came up with a rule. One of their rules was you can't eat family. Like if your wife dies, my family will eat her, and if my wife dies, your family will eat her. We're not going to eat our own, but everyone gets something. So, and they at least initially they sort of patrolled that border very carefully. Don't eat any of your own. There's enough to go around, and that's the horror of it, is eating someone you love.
Well, it's funny too, because I remember so often that growing up, you see cartoons and movies, and cannibalism was something that uncultured peoples did. You always would see the ubiquitous images of like somebody in native dress cooking somebody in a cooking pot, or you would hear stories third, fourth, fifth hand from somebody who is in some other country, and somebody was eating something called long pig. And so
Mm-hmm.
and it's always just these like,
Man corn.
yeah, nobody could ever verify it, but it's like, yeah, oh yeah, I was somewhere, blah, blah, blah. And they're always like, everybody always says, oh, it tasted like pork or something like that. But
Mm.
like, what do you think of all the depictions? Because like, to me, it always seems like the real, like, it's we're civilized. We don't eat human beings, but
Right.
these people who
Well,
are
yeah.
not, they do.
I talk about that in the book, that everyone is somebody else's cannibal.
Yeah.
That the Europeans are insisting in the 17th century and 18th century that Africans are cannibals. And yet when their ships pull up to, the Dakat Gori in Ghana, the slave island, or further down in Angola, the African people there are looking at the boiling pots on the decks of European ships and going, oh, they eat people. That when King Leopold was carrying out his war in the Congo, one of the ways that soldiers who were paid by the number of people they killed could prove the number of people they killed was by cutting off the hands. Like they were delivering baskets of hands to the boss to show that they had killed people. And the rumor very quickly goes around that, oh, Europeans eat hands. That's why they want them. They want them for food. And when canned food is introduced during colonialism, they're like, oh, that's canned humans.
Oh, no.
They kill people and put the humans in cans. So everyone, it's sort of the assumption of my enemy is that they're eating people, and that shows that they're uncivilized. When Columbus shows up on Hispaniola, he reports back, I think they're eating people. And that becomes, in fact, the word cannibal, it comes from an anagram of the Carib and the Caribbean. It's this notion of those people over there are primitive and they eat people, and therefore it is our God-given task to civilize them and stop this behavior. And it becomes an excuse for colonialism. It becomes an excuse to intervene. But and certainly in our own culture, we contribute to that by going, okay, there are these disturbed individuals, Jeffrey Dahmer, Andre Chikatilo in the Soviet Union, who would kill individuals and eat, and say, oh, and we create these sort of wonderful cannibal monsters. Hannibal the cannibal, I mean, the name even rhymes, for the love of God.
Yeah.
And he's sort of this great monster because he cut out your liver and ate it with some fava beans and a nice Chianti. And you're like, oh yeah, that guy's crazy. He's okay. They're hunting a guy who's literally skinning women so he can wear their skin as a dress, but we're bothered by the cultured gentleman who likes to eat human flesh.
Yeah.
Interesting division there. So we see cannibalism as sort of something horrific and a sign that something is wrong, that something is backwards or primitive. And the simple fact of the matter is, when you actually go and read the anthropology of it, there are small examples of cannibalism all over the world. The most predominant one is survival cannibalism. The Moby Dick was inspired by a thing called the sinking of the Essex. A large whale sank the Essex. Guys got in a lifeboat and there wasn't enough food, and it was 2,000 miles to South America. So they said, okay, time to start eating each other. And so that's called survival cannibalism. And that's what happened, for example, in Ukraine in the 1930s, when Stalin sort of introduced this artificial famine that ultimately ended up killing millions of people, the Holodomor. You saw a lot of survival cannibalism, children dying and the parents going, well, we have to live, and the rest of the family has to live, so we're going to eat the dead child. That's one thing, and that's conditions forcing people. You then have mortuary cannibalism, people who eat the dead or parts of the dead. And it's a way to sort of honor, when you look at the cultures that do that, they say, why would I take the body of someone I love and burn it or put it in the ground? That's so barbaric. Who would do that? Instead, we honor by coming together and returning it to the earth in different ways, and feeding it to animals, feeding it to ourselves. You have things like ritual cannibalism, which in and of itself is a form of political cannibalism, whereby the Iroquois, for example, would sometimes eat the hearts of their opponents, one, to show dominance over them, but two, also to gain the strength of a respected enemy.
Yeah.
And it's this notion of by consuming the heart. And there are all these stories from Jesuit missionaries who are like, these guys are practicing cannibalism, and all these stories from the Iroquois being, these Jesuits are eating their God. They keep saying, eat Jesus, they're cannibals. And everyone thinks the other one is the cannibal, because what we're doing is religious and sacred, and we were told to do it by our God, but what you're doing is scary and bad. And so everybody is somebody else's cannibal. Everyone else is doing it wrong. And there are places, again, where burial and cremation are impossible. In Tibet, and in Tibet, for example, you have sky burial, where the body is cut up and fed to birds, and then the bones are ground down into meal and spread throughout the land. And that's because you're living on a mountain with no topsoil. There's no way to bury anyone. There's not enough wood to cremate people. So they actually call it returning to the mountain. And it's this idea of your body will be digested by birds that will then, through their defecation, return you to what you were before you were born. You're just returning to nature. And in Zoroastrianism, both the earth and fire are too pure to sully with a dead body. So again, the body is left out in what are called the towers of silence to be consumed by birds. And then the bones themselves are again ground up and placed within rock. so that they cannot befoul anything sacred or important. And again, the people look at this and go, that's crazy. Why would anyone do that? And the whole idea is, yes, but from outside, our traditions are just as crazy.
Yeah.
There's nothing inherent about pumping a body full of chemicals, dressing in their Sunday go to meat and best, and putting them in a velvet cushion-lined box so we can stare at it for a little while and then all go eat, poor food somewhere in the church basement.
Yeah.
This isn't exactly getting us closer to God in any real way. So all of these things together, and this is sort of one of the primary emphases behind the book, is looking at, and ultimately what we're talking about is how we deal with death, how we deal with the reality of the human corpse after death, and how we deal with death in and of itself, because we never experience our own deaths. We die and then we're gone. But what we do experience is the death of everyone else we've ever known until we die. And so how we process that and how we think about that, we're the only animal that is born knowing that we come with an expiration date, even if we don't know what that date is. Dogs aren't sitting around being like, oh, I've only got about 2 good years left. I want to go to Baja before I die. Instead, they're like, I want to eat what you're eating. Like, that's the top priority right there. Whereas there's a wonderful book, since we're talking about books, called The Worm at the Core, which argues that the reason for all human civilization is the fact that we know we're going to die. The worm at the core of human existence is someday I won't be here. And so everything we do, from having children to painting the Sistine Chapel ceiling, is actually rooted in this fight against death. If I can produce things that exist after me, am I really dead? If I can create this great work of art that will inspire. But for that matter, when I play in my community basketball league on Saturdays, that is yet another way of fighting against death. I'm keeping myself healthy. I'm ignoring the fact that I'm going to die, and instead I'm spending time with people in an activity that gives meaning to my life. So everything we do is fighting the worm at the core.
I wanted to ask you your opinion on something
Sure.
that touches on this. Through the years, I've seen a rise of the vampire as sex symbol. I think it started with Bela Lugosi, maybe even started with Barney the Vampire. But basically, the cannibal, though, I mean, I know there was I can't remember his name, but a famous Japanese cannibal recently who he's got a lot of fans and admirers. And then Hannibal is almost seen him as a sex symbol now with the movies and the TV show. He's a popular, almost seen him as like a superhero.
Yeah.
What is your take on these? Like, where these beloved cannibals?
Well, just like with the vampires, and I think the vampire thing actually started with John Polidori's The Vampire.
Yeah.
That was written the same night as Frankenstein, introducing Lord Riven, who is aristocratic, and he's sort of the first aristocratic vampire. Before that, vampires are just your neighbor walking around town in their burial shroud, and they can walk in the sunlight. It's just a reanimated dead corpse that feeds on the blood of the living. And then Polidori comes along and goes, nah, they sexy. They're aristocratic. Like, they can walk around and hook up with all these women, and women follow. So he introduces the idea of the sexy vampire, and Stoker's like, hold my beer. I'm going to take that even further. And Dracula is an aristocrat who comes to England, and the whole idea of the vampire is it can move freely through society because we don't know he's a vampire. They're all like, oh, here's your charming aristocratic neighbor. He doesn't even sound like he has an accent. He sounds very British. He's very and this sort of very British Victorian prejudice of, oh, well, we're the pinnacle of the world, and he seems like one of us, so he must be a good guy. No, he's actually this horrible monster who's killing all the people. And once they find that out, they get together along with a Texan for some reason. They're like, let's chase him back to his country.
The rando Texan.
The rando Texan who shows up and who, spoiler alert, is the one who ends up killing the vampires. Like, I got my Bowie knife, let's cut off his head. And the British are like, oh, well, we were going to put this stake, but yeah, go ahead and do that then. Let's see what that does. So Stoker has all sorts of fun, and people read the novel and immediately put it up on stage, just as they did Polidori's Vampire. And very soon afterwards, the cinema develops. And actually today, it's wonderful that we're talking today. Today is literally the 100th year anniversary to the day that Nosferatu premiered at the Berliner Tiergarten. The adaptation of Dracula by F.W. Murnau that Florence Stoker, Bram Stoker's widow, sued to try and remove from the face of the earth.
Yeah.
It premiered today, 100 years ago. So we're celebrating Nosferatu at 100 years of wonderful horror movies. Yay.
Very nice.
Well, I think we've sort of been trained from then on to see the monster as kind of desirous. And one of Cohen's 7 monster theories is the monster itself is a kind of desire. This is going to sound like a weird answer, but I remember when Godzilla 1985 came out, a spokesperson from Toho was asked, why more Godzilla movies? Why do people like Godzilla so much? And he thought for a second and he said, want to destroy big buildings, but they cannot. Godzilla destroys big buildings. And so we watch him and cheer him on. And I thought, that's an odd answer. But the more I thought about it, the more I'm like, he's actually right. The reason why we watch Godzilla movies is not to see Godzilla defeated, but to see Godzilla do his thing. The destruction is, I mean, the fun, after the horror of 9/11, part of the fun is watching the New York destroyed in a controlled way in things like Cloverfield and War of the Worlds and Vanishing on 7th Street. It's this notion of we like the destruction. We like seeing things go boom. I live in Los Angeles. I work in the industry. Hollywood loves to see itself destroyed. It does it over and over again. If you watch Independence Day, the destruction of New York is treated as a tragedy. Look at all these people dying. The destruction of Los Angeles, on the other hand, is treated as a comedy. Look at these idiots partying on a building, welcoming the aliens, asking them to bring back Elvis. Let's watch those idiots die.
Yeah.
And when Los Angeles is destroyed, it's kind of funny. Volcano is about a volcano under Los Angeles. The Towering Inferno is an exploding skyscraper. Hollywood loves to watch Hollywood be destroyed. So we like seeing the bad things happen, at least in a controlled environment. No one actually walks down a dark alley going, this is great. I wish I had a snack. I wish I had a big bowl of popcorn. I hear footsteps behind me. This is wonderful. What we want is recreational fear, safe, controlled fear, where we get to partake in the destruction, but there's no actual consequences for it.
Yeah.
No one's watching Friday the 13th, Part 4, rooting for the kids.
Yeah.
We want to see what Jason's going to do to that idiot. Which finally brings us to your question. I think there on some level is the appeal of the bad boy. That the monster itself represents a kind of desire, but there's also, you know, I have a twin sister, and I just remember my parents being like, just don't go with the guy with the motorcycle. We never want to see you on the back of a motorcycle. Too many kids die, right? And so, you know, I'm like, she's thinking about guys with motorcycles right now. You're like, of course you are. You're drawn to the guy who doesn't play by anyone's rules. You're drawn to that bad boy. They're dreamy. There's something about, you know, it's that James Dean thing, the rebel. We like him. You know, you may eventually marry the nice guy with a 401k and a good job who will be a good provider, but you are attracted to the guy who kills and eats people.
Yeah.
And partly, I think, and this is just me being an armchair psychologist, it's also that notion of, but I'll be the one to cure him. He's trying to fill a hole. He's eating something to fill a hole within him that I can fill.
Yeah.
So it's that notion of finding attraction to the bad boy, of being the one to change him, of being the one to make him better. We want the broken guy, and then we want to fix him, which is pretty much what every daytime talk show in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s was all about. Sally Jesse, Raphael, Donahue, let's bring in the bad boy and the women who love them. Geraldo Rivera's in the front row clapping, going, let's talk about this.
Yeah.
And it's the same thing over and over and again. He's a bad boy. I love him. I want to marry him. He's in jail for eating 23 people. Yes, but I love him. Okay, it's not a healthy relationship. And I don't even know if it's love. You're strongly attracted to him. But what's his favorite color? What movies have you watched together? Have you met his family? No, well, I'm his parole officer. Okay, well, there we are then.
You have in this book one of my favorite mythological creatures, which is the Wendigo. Can we talk about that a bit?
Of course we can. I'm fascinated by the Wendigo and the notion that we were talking about the ghoul earlier, and for me, the ghoul and the Wendigo are sort of the examples extraordinaire of anthropophagus monsters developing in climates where food scarcity is a very real thing, where it's not just, you know, every 100 years or so there's a famine. It's if we don't get enough food, we will die every winter, every summer. So in the deserts of Arabia, we get the ghoul, and in the north of Canada, we get the Wendigo. And the scary thing about the Wendigo is the Wendigo, like the vampire, isn't just a monster unto itself. It is a monster that can create other monsters, that the spirit of the Wendigo can get in you. And then you become a Wendigo and you feed upon you know, and so we have all of these reports going back to the first Jesuit missionaries and even before of people who had turned Wendigo, that they were up at Medicine Hat or they were around the Great Lakes and it was a particularly bad winter. And so they begin to, they consume their families and then they're sort of out hunting human flesh because there simply isn't enough in there. And then you have the mythological version of the Wendigo, of course, which is this creature that has a heart of ice, that is the embodiment. I have a little statue of a Wendigo on my desk here in honor of it. It's a deer skull on top of a human skeleton with long claws, and it's this notion of this sort of emaciated creature with antlers and the heart of ice. And the best way to kill a Wendigo, of course, is to force it to eat something that'll melt its heart, and then the Wendigo itself dies. But we also have Sorry, my wife's over there just whispering Elsa from Frozen, who displays Wendigo characteristics.
I love that.
And this is why I'm not allowed to watch Disney films with the children anymore. But Elsa does display some characteristics of Wendigo. So,
See, that's the version I want to see.
yeah, Frozen, the Wendigo years. Suddenly, all those songs mean very different. We have people like Swift Runner or Fast Runner, who was arrested and who had killed his entire family and eaten them, and who was executed by the Canadian government at the beginning of the 20th century for being a Wendigo. And he wasn't a literal Wendigo, but he was a human cannibal. And for the longest time in the books, they had something called Wendigo psychosis, where someone believes they're a Wendigo, which leads them to want to eat human flesh. And I think since then, the psychologists have been like, we're not sure there's ever actually been anyone who actually has had Wendigo psychosis. It's just been survival cannibalism that we've put a label on to sort of explain it, because we don't want to think this thing is possible. So this person clearly did it because they thought they were a Wendigo, and that explains it. When the simple and sad fact of the matter is, when you get hungry enough, you'll eat anything.
Sure. I remember the movie Ravenous. I don't think it was blatantly about Wendigos, but it kind of touched on the same idea.
They do mention Wendigo in the film.
Okay.
That's one of the things that sort of drove me crazy about that film. Is it's set in the sort of the Pacific South, not quite the Southwest, but it's set in the Rocky Mountains, in the Sierra Nevadas. And Wendigo is sort of, Ojibwe and Cree and Northeastern monster. Coming from the First Nations of the Northeast, extending as far as Alberta, but certainly does not make it down to the Sierra Nevadas. So it is that sort of during the Native American craze in the 1990s with things like Dances with Wolves and Clear Cut, and there were sort of there's this explosion of Native American cinema and Native American culture being embraced by popular culture. Ravenous sort of came out and just pulled the Wendigo 1,000 miles away and said, let's just do it here. And again, this is no slight on the film. Antonia Bird created this absolutely remarkable film with some great performances from people, genuinely disturbing. But the whole concept is, well, if you're Native American, you know about the Wendigo, regardless of which nation you're actually with. And that, if anything, and I do talk about this a bit in the book, the part of the problem is with horror writers and filmmakers is they are happy to culturally appropriate. We're happy to grab and move something over here. And what happens if we take an Aswang and stick it in Minnesota? So it's this Filipino monster, but suddenly it's living in Minnesota, and isn't that crazy? And isn't that great? And on the one hand, yes, it's an interesting concept in terms of monster fish out of water, but you're taking this creature out of the cultural context that created it and just looking at its monstrousness.
Yeah.
And in doing so, you're sort of making that culture the monster, or you're flattening culture in terms of, well, all Native Americans know this. No, they don't. That's not right. So you're misrepresenting a culture, you're misrepresenting a people, and you're relying on stereotypes for entertainment. And that is a problem.
Well, Kevin, I really want to thank you for being on the program, and I've loved getting a chance to talk to you about this book, Eaters of the Dead, Myths and Realities of Cannibal Monsters. It's out available now. You can get it on all major distributors, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, etc. And you can also check out the other numerous books by Kevin as well.
Yes, please. And thank you for having me. This was a real pleasure. The conversations aren't always polite or
really
appetizing, but are people consumption of dead bodies?
Have you ever had an interview or not be polite, or like they've been like dismissive or anything?
Oh, no. I think perhaps polite is the wrong word. It's lunchtime, and we're like, and then they ate the liver. Doesn't necessarily make for. I guess that's my New England showing. This isn't polite conversation. Doesn't mean that it's rude conversation. It's just, can we not talk about consuming dead bodies while we're enjoying this ham?
Yeah, I forget about things like that myself, and my family has to remind me.
The danger of being well read is that nothing is off topic, and when you're excited about learning everything, the danger is when someone mentions something in passing, you're like, oh, but then in 1947 this happened in the jungles of Burma, and of course the punji steaks caused bacteria to spread rapidly throughout the body, and everyone's like, this is the worst Thanksgiving ever now. And my defense of, well, you brought it up, never flies. So
it's so weird because you just meant we were just literally talking about punji sticks at dinner last night. I swear to God. That's so weird. And my family knew a lot about them, and I was surprised. I'm like, you guys know about this? And they're like, oh yeah, we're big connoisseurs on the topic of punji sticks. I'm like, all right then.
Your family sounds cool. That's awesome.
You're a very weird bunch. Well, it's been very good talking. I hope we get to have you on again.
Happy to come by anytime.
It was my conversation with Kevin Wetmore. I hope you enjoyed it, and I also hope we can have Kevin back on again one day. On Wednesday, we will return with my conversation with Arturo Incicio of Gusto Bread in Long Beach. This is a new bakery that produces artisan loaves in its community. I really enjoy getting a chance to talk to Arturo and talk about him enacting his dream of wanting to be a baker and open a bakery. On Friday, we have Mariana Nuno Ruiz and Ian Macaroner here to talk about their book, Dining with the Dead. It is all about Dios de los Muertos, the Day of the Dead. It's a wonderful book, and it's full of delicious, amazing recipes and really phenomenal photography. Mariana and Ian are a husband and wife team, and they were really lovely to talk to. I had a really great time talking with them, and I feel like I've known them all my life. I hope you all have a wonderful week and you can listen to our other episodes. If you like our podcast, please spread the word by sharing links to our episodes on social media. Our podcast theme song, Talk About Love, is sung by the band Kitty Cat Fan Club. Their label, Asian Man Records, has given permission for its use. You can check them out and other bands and get an album at Asian Man Records by going to the website asianmanrecords.com. We also have a link in the bio. Have a great week, all of you, and until we meet again, keep on cooking.
I've been getting better than you.